Picture this. You are Sultan Sanjah, the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world. You wake inside a bedchamber guarded by 1,000 elite soldiers. You sweep aside your silk sheets and your hand strikes cold steel. A silver dagger stands upright in the floorboards, planted exactly 4 inches from your throat. No guards heard a single footstep. No doors were forced open. A scrap of parchment rests beneath the hilt, and the words written on it make your blood run cold. Had we not wished the Sultan well, the dagger would have been in his heart, not the floor. This moment of absolute vulnerability inside a room of gold marks one of the most terrifying shifts in the entire history of power. And if moments like this are what keep you awake at night, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Crimson Archive, because we are just getting started. While the world turned its eyes toward grand crusades and massive sieges, the secret court chronicles of the Seljuks whispered of a shadow state that operated by an entirely different set of rules. This was the calling card of the Order of Assassins. They did not need an army to bring a kingdom to its knees. They only needed the psychological paralysis of a single well-placed blade. So how did a tiny cult of mountain outcasts manage to hold the greatest empires of the medieval age hostage without ever winning a single open battle? The Seljuk Empire dominated the 11th century with a military machine that crushed everything in its path. Their heavy cavalry turned the plains of Persia and Anatolia into graveyards for their enemies. They built grand universities and magnificent mosques to cement their Sunni orthodoxy. They were a superpower in every sense of the word, and they believed that sheer numbers and ironclad walls guaranteed their survival. Hassan-i Sabbah watched this empire from the fringes. He was a brilliant polymath, a man who measured the stars and calculated the movements of planets, but his true obsession lay in the mechanics of fear. Hassan understood that his people, the Nizari Ismailis, could never survive a head-on collision with the Seljuk war machine. He needed a fortress that defied the logic of the plains. He found it buried deep in the Alborz Mountains, a jagged ridge of rock called Alamut, the eagle's nest. Instead of marching soldiers toward the castle, Hassan sent missionaries into the garrison. They carried no swords. They carried ideas. Slowly, the guards inside those walls began to look toward Hassan for guidance rather than toward the governor they served. When Hassan finally walked through the gates, the fortress had already surrendered from within. He paid the former governor 3,000 gold dinars and calmly collected the keys. Not a single arrow was fired. The order had its headquarters. Hassan transformed that mountain peak into a laboratory for a new kind of warfare. He recruited men who had lost everything to the Seljuk expansion. He trained them to vanish into crowds, to master foreign languages, and to wait for months with the patience of stone until the perfect moment arrived. These men were called the Fidai, those who sacrificed themselves. The first major target changed the political landscape of the entire medieval world. Nizam ul-Mulk, the Grand Vizier and the true brain behind the Seljuk Empire, was traveling toward the royal harem. A man dressed as a Sufi mystic stepped out of the crowd. He did not run. He did not conceal his intention. He walked directly toward the vizier's litter and drove a knife into his heart. Then he stood his ground, waiting calmly for the guards to cut him down, a look of absolute peace on his face. The shockwave that followed was unlike anything the ruling elite had ever felt. Walls no longer seemed solid. Bodyguards no longer felt trustworthy. The assassins had proven that no one, regardless of their power or their protection, was beyond their reach. They had turned the very infrastructure of the empire against itself, using the Sultan's own palaces and mosques as the stage for their theater of terror. The Seljuks scrambled to respond and found nothing to strike back against. There were no front lines. There were no armies to charge. Every time they executed a suspected assassin, they created a new martyr and sent a dozen more men running toward the mountains to join the cause. The mountain cult had cracked the code of asymmetrical warfare and turned their small numbers into a weapon that paralyzed 3 empires simultaneously. The silver dagger on Sultan Sanjah's floor was more than a threat. It was proof that the old world of kings and armies was finished, and the age of the shadow had begun. Before he became the most feared man in the East, Hassan-i Sabbah was simply a boy with a library. He grew up in the city of Ray, a bustling crossroads of trade and intellect near what is today Tehran. His father was a strict scholar, and young Hassan spent his childhood devouring every text he could find on geometry, astronomy, and law. He did not set out to become a revolutionary. He set out to master the universe through the sheer force of his own mind. In his early years he followed the mainstream sunny path, the very ideology he would later spend his life dismantling. But Ray was a city where dangerous ideas passed freely between travelers. One afternoon Hassan encountered a preacher of the Ismaili faith. He laughed off the man's arguments at first, confident in his own training. But the more they debated, the more Hassan felt a void opening beneath his certainty. A severe illness nearly killed him shortly after. In the fever of his recovery he made a vow that if he survived, he would dedicate himself entirely to the Ismaili cause. He did not simply join a religion. He joined a war for the soul of the Islamic world. Hassan traveled to Cairo, the glittering heart of the Fatimid Caliphate, to complete his education. Cairo in the 11th century was a metropolis of white marble and intellectual fire. He studied at the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest centers of learning that history has ever produced. He sharpened his skills in linguistics, mathematics, and the art of the dawah, the missionary call. But he also saw the decay hiding behind the gold leaf. The Fatimid leadership was weak, distracted by internal squabbles and the rising ambitions of their own generals. A violent clash with the powerful military commander Bad al-Jamali forced Hassan into exile. He was thrown onto a ship and nearly drowned when it wrecked in the Mediterranean. He did not interpret this as failure. He read it as a sign. What followed was nearly a decade of wandering across the deserts and mountain ranges of Persia. He moved from village to village disguised as a common traveler or a humble teacher, and all the while he was quietly building a secret network of followers. He was not simply preaching. He was scouting. He was searching for the crack in the Seljuk armor. His eyes eventually settled on the Alborz Mountains. Most military commanders looked at those peaks and saw a logistical nightmare. Hassan looked at them and saw a sanctuary. He identified Alamut as the perfect site for his experiment. The fortress sat on a narrow ridge nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. The only path to its gates was a single winding track that 2 men could defend against 100. The takeover itself was a masterclass in slow-burn subversion. Hassan sent his most charismatic followers into the surrounding valleys first. They helped locals with their harvests. They taught the children. They gradually convinced the people that the Seljuk governor sitting inside that castle was nothing more than a foreign oppressor. Then his missionaries turned their attention to the garrison itself. They did not offer bribes. They offered purpose. By the year 1090, the governor of Alamut had quietly become a prisoner in his own home. Every guard at his door and every servant who brought him food had already pledged their life to the scholar living in the shadows of the nearby village. When Hassan-i Sabbah finally walked up that mountain path and passed through the gates, he carried no weapon. He simply sat down and informed the governor that the castle no longer belonged to him. The governor found that not a single one of his men would lift a finger in his defense. Hassan allowed him to leave with 3,000 gold dinars, a gesture that demonstrated even to his enemies that his word meant something. From the moment he stepped inside Alamut, Hassan never left the fortress for the remaining 35 years of his life. He lived in a small room filled with scrolls and maps and directed a global network of agents from a wooden desk. He established a code of conduct so severe that he executed his own sons for minor infractions, making it clear to everyone that no one stood above the law of the order. He had taken a pile of mountain stones and transformed them into a sovereign state with no borders, no conventional army, and no tax registers, yet one that held the fate of kings in its hands. Alamut under his rule became something the world had never seen before. A university of the forbidden. While the rest of the known world was descending into the chaos of the First Crusade, the people of Alamut were studying the stars and refining the art of the hidden blade. Hassan-i Sabbah had understood something fundamental that every king around him had missed. True power does not come from holding land. It comes from holding the minds of the people who walk upon it. The most enduring image attached to the assassins comes from the travel writings of Marco Polo, recorded nearly a century after the fortress of Alamut had already crumbled to ruin. He describes a secret valley hidden between 2 mountains, filled with gardens of impossible beauty, gilded pavilions, and streams flowing with wine and milk and honey. In this paradise, beautiful women danced and sang for young recruits until they were convinced they had literally stepped into heaven. According to the legend, Hassan would drug these young men with a mysterious substance, carry them into the garden while they slept, then pull them back out into the harsh reality of the mountain fortress. He told them that if they died in his service, they would return to that place forever. It is a spectacular story. It is also almost certainly a lie. Marco Polo never set foot inside Alamut. He gathered his details from campfire gossip and the terrified whispers of enemies who wanted to paint the Nizari Ismailis as nothing more than brainwashed drug addicts. The very word Hashshashin, from which the modern word assassin eventually grew, was in all likelihood a slur. In the medieval Middle East, calling someone a hashisha was roughly equivalent to calling them low-life scum. It was not a description of their habits. It was an insult aimed at their status as outcasts. The reality of how Hassan-i Sabbah reshaped the human mind is far more sophisticated and far more disturbing than a garden full of dancing women and drugged fruit. Historical chroniclers do mention potions and herbs, but modern neurobiological analysis points away from cannabis entirely. Hashish is a sedative. It makes a person slow, uncoordinated, and prone to paranoia. A man under its influence is the last person you would send into a high-security palace to strike a moving target with surgical precision. The evidence instead points toward alkaloids found in plants like henbane and dachra. In carefully controlled doses, these substances do not simply produce hallucinations. They induce a state of lucid dreaming in which the subject remains physically capable but enters a condition where the line between reality and suggestion completely dissolves. Hassan was not merely a theologian. He was an early master of sensory deprivation and psychological conditioning. The training began with isolation. A recruit would spend weeks in a dark and silent room, stripped of every sensory anchor that normally ties a person to their own identity. During this period, they were fed a steady diet of intense religious instruction centered on the absolute authority of the Imam. When the brain is starved of light and sound, it becomes desperate for meaning and extraordinarily open to suggestion. At the peak of this mental fragility, the substance was administered. The recruit did not wake up in a physical garden. He experienced a chemically induced vision that felt more real than the stone walls surrounding him. Because the vision was shaped by everything his masters had whispered into his ears during the weeks of isolation, it reinforced every belief he had been given. This was not simple brainwashing. It was the weaponization of the subconscious mind. By the time the recruit returned to full consciousness, he did not merely believe in the cause. He had seen the reward with his own eyes. He carried a physiological certainty that death was nothing more than a doorway to a state he had already tasted. That is what made the Fidai so dangerous. You cannot bribe a man who has seen paradise. You cannot threaten a man who regards his own body as a temporary vessel. The discipline inside Alamut was equally severe. While the myths speak of wine and debauchery, the historical record shows a community following the strictest behavioral code in the entire region. Hassan banned music and wine within the fortress walls and reportedly had one of his own sons executed on the mere suspicion of drinking alcohol. Life inside Alamut meant asceticism, relentless study, and constant physical training. The recruits learned to speak foreign dialects, to absorb the social customs of their enemies, and to blend into a royal court or a crowded marketplace without drawing a single glance. That level of preparation demanded a clear mind, not one dulled by narcotics. The paradise they fought for was not a drug-induced fantasy. It was a political and spiritual vision of a world where their persecuted faith could finally stand without fear. In their own understanding, they were not assassins. They were the Nizari Ismailis, the guardians of the true line of the Prophet. To the empires surrounding them, they were a terrifying enigma. To themselves, they were the only people alive who understood the truth. Hassan-i Sabbah had built something history had never witnessed before. A school for the perfect soldier. He had grasped that a single man with a disciplined mind and a controlled heart was worth more than 1,000 hired blades. The Seljuk sultans were searching for an army to confront. Hassan had given them a ghost they could not touch. The air inside the great mosque of Isfahan hung thick with the scent of amber and the rhythmic chanting of thousands of worshippers. It was a Friday in the year 1092, the most sacred day of the week in the most public space of the Seljuk capital. Nizam ul-Mulk, the Grand Vizier and the true architect of the empire's stability, moved through the parting crowd. He was a man of nearly 80, draped in the heavy robes of his office and surrounded by a phalanx of elite guards. He felt untouchable, shielded by the sanctity of the mosque and the sheer weight of his own authority. A young man dressed in the threadbare wool of a Sufi mystic stepped out from behind a pillar. He had the shuffling, humble gait of a beggar seeking a blessing. Nothing about him triggered a single alarm in the minds of the veteran bodyguards watching the crowd. As the vizier passed, the young man reached into his sleeve. He did not produce a bowl for arms. He drew a long, slender blade. Before any guard could register the movement, the knife had found the gap between the vizier's ribs. The strike was surgical, delivered by a hand that did not shake. The mosque erupted into chaos. Guards swarmed the attacker with their swords rising and falling in a desperate attempt to reclaim what they had already lost. But the young man made no effort to defend himself or vanish into the screaming crowd. He stood over the dying vizier with his eyes calm, almost luminous, as the blades tore through his own flesh. He was dead within seconds of his target. This was the moment the world learned what would later be called propaganda by the deed. Hassan-i Sabbah had understood something that no strategist before him had fully articulated. A killing in the dark is a private tragedy. A killing in the light is a political earthquake. The order rejected the quiet efficiency of poison or the ambiguity of an accidental fall from a horse. They wanted witnesses. They needed the public to see the blood on the mosque floor and the serene expression on the face of the killer who had embraced his own death. By choosing the most crowded places and the most sacred moments, they turned the very fabric of society into a weapon against the ruling class. They demonstrated that no amount of military might could shield a man if his enemy was willing to pay for his death with their own life. The death of Nizam al-Mulk did more than remove a brilliant administrator. It shattered the internal logic of the Seljuk state. Within weeks, the Sultan himself was dead under circumstances that remain suspicious to this day. The empire, which had appeared to be a monolithic wall of iron, fractured almost overnight into a dozen competing factions. Princes turned against their brothers. Generals scrambled for whatever territory their hands could hold. The assassins did not need to conquer Isfahan or Baghdad. They simply removed the person holding all the pieces together and watched the entire machine vibrate itself apart. This was asymmetrical warfare in its purest form. The Seljuks were built for massive traditional campaigns. They understood how to lay siege to a city for months, how to unleash thousands of horse archers across an open plain, and how to manage vast supply chains across hundreds of miles. They were completely unprepared for an enemy that operated on the scale of a single human life. You cannot launch a counterattack against a ghost. You cannot retaliate against a man who is already dead. The psychological damage was even more devastating than the political vacuum left behind. Every high-ranking official across the Islamic world began studying the faces of their own servants with suspicion. Rumors spread that assassins had infiltrated every level of government. Was the man pouring the sultan's wine a secret convert? Was the scribe copying military dispatches a sleeper agent for Alamut? Paranoia became the defining atmosphere of the medieval court. Powerful men began wearing chain-mail shirts beneath their silk tunics even when climbing into bed. They withdrew from public life entirely, effectively imprisoning themselves inside their own fortresses in a desperate attempt to feel safe. Hassan-i Sabbah sat in his library above the clouds and watched the ripples of his work spread across the world below him. He had built a system where the fear of an attack was more effective than the attack itself. He did not need to kill every general in the Seljuk army. He only needed to make every general believe that he could. The order had successfully dismantled the social contract of the era. They had shown that the vertical hierarchy of kings and subjects was catastrophically fragile when confronted by a horizontal network of believers united by a single unshakable purpose. As the Seljuk Empire began bleeding out from 1,000 internal wounds, the assassins expanded their reach. They seized mountain fortress after mountain fortress, creating a scattered constellation of power stretching from the borders of modern Afghanistan all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean. They had become a state without a map, a government that existed in the spaces between empires. The propaganda by the deed had worked. The world now knew that there was a power living in the mountains that answered to no king on earth, and that the price of ignoring it was a silver blade buried in the heart of your capital. By the middle of the 12th century, the terror had migrated west, crossing the deserts of Iraq into the rugged limestone hills of Syria. While the masters at Alamut remained the ideological heart of the movement, a new figure emerged who became the face of the order for the Western world. His name was Rashid ul-Din Sinan, but to the Crusaders and the local sultans he was known by a title that carried the weight of legend. The Old Man of the Mountain. Sinan did not simply inherit a network of killers. He built a shadow kingdom and used it to play the great powers of the Levant against each other with the precision of a master chess player. The most formidable opponent Sinan ever faced was not a Crusader king but the legendary Saladin, the man who would eventually recapture Jerusalem for Islam. Saladin was a genius of conventional warfare, a leader of immense charisma who was determined to unify the Muslim world under his banner. To Saladin, the assassins were a dangerous heresy threatening his vision of a unified front. He decided to accomplish what the Seljuks had failed to do. He would march into the heart of their territory and destroy them. In 1176 Saladin's army carved a path through the Syrian countryside and laid siege to Masyaf, the headquarters of the Syrian branch of the order. Saladin was a careful man. He had already survived 2 attempts on his life by Sinan's agents, and he took every precaution. He cleared the brush surrounding his tent so that no one could approach unseen. He scattered fine chalk and sand around his sleeping area to catch any footprint. He slept inside a specially constructed wooden tower within his own camp, surrounded by his most trusted guards. He was, by every reasonable measure, untouchable. One morning he woke to find that every precaution had counted for nothing. Beside his bed sat a platter of fresh warm cakes, a local specialty that his own mother used to make. Next to the cakes lay a poisoned dagger and a note written in Sinan's own hand. The message was simple. You are within our reach. The chalk on the floor was completely undisturbed. The guards outside reported seeing nothing. The cakes were still warm. Saladin, the man who would later defy the combined armies of European kings, understood in that moment that he was fighting something that did not obey the rules of the physical world. He did not simply lift the siege. He sent envoys seeking a permanent truce. The great sultan had conquered cities and broken empires, but he could not conquer a shadow that baked cakes in the middle of a war zone. From that day forward Saladin and the Old Man of the Mountain maintained a quiet and deeply strange alliance. The assassins stopped targeting his commanders, and in return Saladin allowed their mountain fortresses to exist as an independent state within his sphere of influence. Rashid al-Din Sinan was a master of this kind of theatrical diplomacy. He understood completely that his power did not rest on the number of soldiers he could field, but on the stories people told about him in the dark. Tales spread through Crusader camps that Sinan's men would leap from the highest towers of Masyaf at his mere command, plummeting to their deaths just to demonstrate their devotion to a visiting diplomat. European knights, raised on the clear hierarchies of feudalism, were shaken to their foundations by this level of obedience. They began to genuinely believe that the Old Man of the Mountain possessed supernatural abilities, that he could read minds and bend the winds of the mountain passes to his will. Sinan leaned into every one of these myths deliberately. He rarely appeared in public, and when he did he was veiled and surrounded by an atmosphere of absolute stillness. He turned his small Syrian territory into a diplomatic grey zone, offering his services to the Crusaders when it served his purposes to weaken a local rival, and then turning back to the Muslim princes whenever the Crusaders grew dangerously strong. He was the ultimate wild card in the bloody game being played across the Holy Land. This period marked the transformation of the order from a purely religious movement into a sophisticated political entity. Under Sinan, the assassins became the supreme power brokers of the medieval Middle East. They did not seek to rule the world. They sought to guarantee that no one else could rule it completely. By maintaining a perfect balance of terror, they ensured their own survival in a landscape of giants. The Old Man of the Mountain had demonstrated something that would echo across centuries of political thought. In a world of kings and empires, the most dangerous man alive is always the one who rules the space between them. When the first waves of European knights arrived in the Holy Land, they came prepared to fight armies of flesh and steel. They understood the thunder of heavy cavalry and the grinding patience of a castle siege. What they were entirely unprepared for was an enemy that wore no uniform, marched under no banner, and seemed to carry no fear of death whatsoever. To the Frankish Crusaders, the Nizari Ismailis were a terrifying mystery, a shadowy brotherhood they called the Hashshashin. The Europeans had no interest in the complex theological rift between Shia and Sunni Islam. All they saw was a brotherhood of mountain warriors who could reach into the most fortified Christian strongholds and take the life from a king as easily as a farmer plucks fruit from a tree. The relationship between the Order and the great Crusader military brotherhoods, the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, became one of the strangest and darkest mirrors of medieval politics. On the surface, they were mortal enemies, religious warriors standing on opposite sides of a holy war. Beneath the surface, the reality was far more complicated and far more interesting. And that is where we will continue next time on Crimson Archive. If this story gripped you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The history hiding in the shadows is always the history worth knowing.